Well, hello, everyone. I hope you are well. It's good to be with you as always. And we took a little bit of a break. It was actually my wife's and my birthdays, and so it's over the 4th of July. So it's been a full but very rich kind of couple weeks, and getting settled into the semester a bit more. For those who don't know, I'm actually in boxes right now. I've been moving offices on campus, and so unfortunately, I'm in that current state where my boxes have been moved, but bookshelves have not been, and so work has been interesting. I was hoping to be in my office already, so I could be doing this from there. I am currently at home, and they're building a house in what looks like my neighbor's front yard. I'm going to be honest. I'm not. The, the thought that there was like a plot of land there would be very generous, and so it's been noisy and hard to know when a podcast would work, but it's good to be back with you. I'm wanting to kind of pause on some things and shift my attention a little bit. I mentioned, I think, last time that I wanted to talk a little bit about my own sense of where is the spiritual formation discussion going. But I also did a post on the Substack that talked about the forgotten doctrines of spiritual formation. And so I want to talk about that as well. And those overlap in some interesting ways. One of the reasons why I want to do this specific kind of episode of looking to the future a little bit of what is going to go on in the spiritual formation conversation is that there's been an unusual amount of conversation about it now. I think my generation, if I could put it that way, and there's several of us working in very different areas. Again, for those of you who maybe have not listened to previous episodes, my view of spiritual formation, which even though I'm pretty unique in how I define this, I think this is just the accepted vision, whether or not it's made explicit, is that spiritual formation is how the Spirit forms us into the likeness of Jesus. Such that spiritual formation is not a view of something, right? Like you can't say, oh, so-and-so believes this because he believes in spiritual formation, or she thinks this because she believes in spiritual formation, or whatever. The reason for that is for the same reason you can't say, oh, they believe in the atonement, therefore they must believe in penal substitution, or something along those lines, right? Like, as with anything in theology, a view of something, right, is going to take on different shapes to it, right? So when theologians talk about Christology, there might say something like, well, do you have in mind a Lutheran or a Reformed Christology, right? Because there's going to be slightly different ways to articulate features of that. Same thing when we get to the church and ecclesiology and so on and so forth. So the spiritual formation, the view of it I'm articulating is a word-centered, spirit-empowered, whole life spirituality, right? So that's been the focus of this podcast, the focus of my Substack, and that's going to be a specific, for lack of better word, brand, a specific kind of spiritual formation that is in a distinctively evangelical mode. Now, one of the things that caught my attention, and I did a post on this that I'll link to all of this in the show notes, but Trevin Wax, several weeks ago now, wrote a post where he was kind of narrating the three waves that have occurred over the last 50 years in evangelicalism. And of course, this is assuming his kind of experience of evangelicalism. One of the things that caught my attention is that it was very true of my experience of evangelicalism. Again, that doesn't mean it's true of everyone's experience of it. There's all these, especially with a word like evangelical, that can mean almost anything. But what he articulates there is the first wave, wave one, was what he called spirit-filled worship. And then wave two was seeker-sensitive church growth. And so those two are obviously very overlapping, right? The spirit-filled worship where there became a focus more on, what we might call kind of the affections in worship, what some others might just call more of the emotions in worship. I don't like the term emotion. I think it's unspecified and unhelpful. I prefer the older terminology of passions and affections. But a kind of affectionate worship, like Christian praise and worship should awaken the affections of the heart. The seeker-sensitive church growth movement grabbed onto that, but then focused on, and we should captivate the affections of even unbelievers to such a degree that they come to think well, who is this Jesus figure? So it was really focused on unbelievers. And now I grew up in the seeker-sensitive church growth movement. I grew up at Willow Creek Community Church. And so those first two things, I was like, yeah, that that speaks to my experience quite well. The third wave he called the gospel centrality movement. And again, I would say that was a much narrower one rather than the broader movement of evangelicalism. That was one that was more kind of the Gospel Coalition crowd. I would say reformed-leaning evangelicals, right? So again, I'm very much in that. Like I preach monthly at a church that is explicitly gospel-centered. That's in our statements. That's So again, the watching him narrate those three things, I was like, yeah, this is something that speaks very much to my experience. But then it was interesting because he named those three, and then he said, I think a fourth is emerging. So that was more of a question mark. Is it or is it not? It's kind of emerging. And he turned to the fourth wave being spiritual formation. And what's fascinating about that is that unlike the first three, which were kind of all in their infancy when they came to their own, the spiritual formation conversation as we know it today started in the late 70s. And so, even Wax kind of narrates, how these different movements function. And one of the things he says about the spiritual formation movement is that it seems to be less reactive than the other ones. But I argue in this post I did that actually that's part of its maturity. Like it's grown up in a certain sort of way. It started actually as a reaction. You have forgotten these things. Why don't we ever talk about these sorts of things anymore, right? But now it's settled, and it's now in a kind of different level, a different place of its own maturation. Now, in another article, so along with the Wax article, my friend Steve Porter kind of discussed a little bit what he thinks is next for the spiritual formation movement. And this is something I want to do in this podcast in a moment here. But to do so, he exposits Kees Kiesler's discussion. Kees is a professor of spiritual formation at Friends University. He's a part of the Apprentice National Gathering with James Bryan Smith. And Kees did his dissertation on Willard. There's been a handful of dissertations on Willard now, which is interesting. I'm very interested in Kees's. I've yet to read it, but I know he responds to some misunderstandings of Dallas. I think Dallas, like all great thinkers, is someone very easy to misunderstand. He's very easy to critique by just quoting a verse here and there or a passage here and there and kind of missing the broader context or missing other places where he seems to say the opposite, let's say, or something along those lines. I find that Dallas often drops qualifications in every now and again. He kind of sprinkles them, and they're easy to miss. And if you miss them, you actually do quite a lot of damage to his own view. But for Kiesler, part of what he was doing in the dissertation is he was articulating the waves of the spiritual formation movement itself. Right? So unlike Trevin Wax's discussion, this was focused solely on the spiritual formation movement. And so for Kiesler, he says the first wave was from about 1978, right? Again, that's what I was saying, the late 70s, to 1988, and was defined by who he calls kind of trailblazers. So most of these folks' names are kind of well known, although there's many that aren't. But folks like Willard Foster and Eugene Peterson. Actually, there's a figure that's often ignored in this conversation, which is Donald Blesh, the evangelical theologian. He never was directly connected, as far as I know, with the kind of Willard Foster version of the conversation, but he was doing that work even before this, as well as someone like Richard Lovelace would be important on this. So there, again, there's a lot of things going on here. Just because we remember certain key figures doesn't mean they're the only ones, and I'm not suggesting Kiesler's doing this, but it's just for us to remember and to keep in mind that there's actually a lot going on here. There's a lot of different conversations being had. But these trailblazers were basically saying, look, we've forgotten some key things here. And Richard Lovelace does this really quite well in his work on renewal, the work that was so important to Tim Keller, where Lovelace is saying, look, we have forgotten all our spirituality. Evangelicals have this rich spiritual tradition, and no one knows it. Right? So that's different than Willard and Foster, right? I mean, they were offering a critique, but it wasn't that critique. It was kind of like that. Willard would say things like that every now and again. Foster would say things like that every now and again. But for someone like Lovelace, that was front and center for him. Then you have a second wave. Now, this is from 1989, Kiesler says, to about 2007. And this is focused on theological and institutional maturity, he says. And so this is when we see conferences starting, resources being produced on a large-scale level. This is, it was right during this time that my department was started, the Institute for Spiritual Formation. And this is, what's interesting about spiritual formation, I think, at least in the circles I run in the more kind of conservative evangelical kind of circles, I think spiritual formation, we kind of looked at folks like Willard and Foster, and there was a little bit of like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you guys are talking about, sure. But then there was also a little bit of worry. Some of that had to do with the language. Some of that had to do with its sourcing. Like who are we quoting now? Like, what do these people believe? Right? Like, there was a little bit of half in, half outness to it. But the benefit of that is that the church's relative ambivalence made spiritual formation move more into the academy. And the gift of that is that that became a little bit, I think, of an incubator that has allowed it to mature, that has allowed it to kind of grow up in a little bit healthier sort of way. It wasn't ever a kind of, big explosion of interest where you had it taken over by kind of prima donnas or something like that. Rather, it's always been a kind of slower sort of a thing. Even the conferences tend to be, in my experience, a little more relational, a little less celebrity worship, a little more, hey, let's just connect with people who care about life with Jesus, right? And so I think that has been a real gift. But then the third wave, Keyes argues, started around 2008 and is defined by the diffusion of the movement's ideas and their values in both the academy and the church. And so this is where now we're kind of in the midst of this third wave. And so Porter narrates this to us in the article I'll post, because this is, part of Keyes' dissertation that hasn't been published yet. But then Porter takes this and really asks a big question, which is basically, can we actually say that spiritual formation has infiltrated the church? It does seem to me that, along with Porter, that actually it is more parachurch ministries that have actually grabbed onto this than the church itself. And, I do wonder academically if it's true. I think Keyes is right that what happened is departments were started. But if spiritual formation is truly an integrative discipline, it can never remain kind of sequestered off into one department. One of the interesting case studies of this is my own department. So when they started what we call ISF, the Institute for Spiritual Formation, 21 years ago or something, I think it was about 2005, they made it where they were flooded with interest. And so they put a hard cap on the department. They don't allow any other seminary students to take their classes because we interview every student that comes, and it's a very kind of high vulnerability, high relationality kind of thing. We accept one cohort a year, and that cohort, which is usually between 32 to 40-ish, and when we started, they were accepting only about half the people that applied, right? So there was a massive amount of interest in the program. And after several years, the seminary began to say, well, wait a second. If this stuff matters so much, why isn't this what we're all doing, right? And so one of the things my department did was that we started a program that I eventually was hired to be the main professor for, which is what we call the SF Core. And the Spiritual Formation Core is part of the core of Talbot, which is the whole seminary. And so every single seminary student, whether they're doing an MA in philosophy, an MDiv, a biblical studies degree, whatever, they're doing 3 courses in spiritual theology. They're doing Intro to Spiritual Theology. That's where we're articulating the kind of nature, processes, and directives of Christian growth. They're doing a class called Personal Foundations, which is a psych integration class where we wrestle with life with God and with one another. So if the first class is love God with all your soul, mind, body, and strength, the second class is love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a much more communal dynamic to it. And then the third class is vocation and calling. So there's then a class, and that class is a kind of hybrid class. So the idea is when you take these classes, you're put in a cohort group. You follow them together for a year and a half, wrestling through your life with them. And then by the third semester, they're actually helping you navigate, why did I even come to seminary to begin with? Like, what has the Lord called me to? What should I be giving myself to, right? In these sorts of questions. And so that is a model, I think, of how things could become integrated. I think it's rare. I've never actually seen it outside of our institution work that way. More often than not, I see seminaries or Christian colleges say things like, okay, we need a class on this. Who reads Willard? Why don't you teach it? And that's not integration, right? And that's great. We need at least a class, but we need to start asking questions, not only across the curriculum itself, but even across the faculty. Because if you're teaching Hebrew, that class should be integrated in spiritual formation. And it is not enough. One of the things that drives me bonkers is how many faculty I hear saying, well, everything's spiritual formation. Of course I'm doing spiritual formation. That is simply folly. Maybe it's possible it is formative in a spiritual sort of way. More likely than not, it isn't. More likely than not, your students are learning Hebrew in the flesh. Honestly, they're most likely digging deep, turning to their own natural resources to memorize flashcards. Now, there's a lot of invitations to them that you can provide to draw near to the Lord. Assuming that's just happening, I mean, the Lord doesn't even assume this about the church, let alone the academy. And so there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot we need to do. So I think Porter is certainly right about that critique. And I think he's right that basically we need to really wrestle with what is going on with the church. That becomes one of the most kind of asked questions I raised in my classes by my students. What does this look like in the church? So let me just give two things in terms of where are we at and where are we going. And this isn't, I'm not trying to kind of give a kind of prophetic word here about what's actually going to happen. I'm saying what I think should happen. And there's two main things. The first is that for the spiritual, if there's going to be kind of a fourth wave here, if we take Kiesler's 3 waves of spiritual formation, what does the next one need to be? I think there needs to be 2 things that define it. The first is that we need a theological spiritual theology. Now, for those of you who may be familiar with this language, I'm borrowing this language from John Webster, who talks about a theological theology. We need a theological spiritual theology. More often than not, in the spiritual formation discussion, particularly on the lay level, I see what happens is people swap out theology and the work of the Spirit for sociology and pop psychology. Now, look, I teach psych integration stuff. There's a lot of good things we can learn there and a lot of integration we can do. But it needs to be run theologically because that means it needs to be run Christianly. Christians do not have the same view of anthropology and psychology as atheists do. They simply don't. You will never find an atheist saying, it is no longer I who live, but Christ in me, right? As Paul says in Galatians 2:20. That is a different psychology. Like, we have to give an account. Now maybe the kind of structures of psychology are the same, but knowing that we are made to image God changes everything about how we approach human psychology. So we need a theological spiritual theology that helps orient our understanding of formation to the likeness of Jesus, and therefore accords with our understanding of theology as a whole. And so, churches are going to have to wrestle with, who are we theologically? Like where do we stand on salvation, on the atonement? How do we talk about the Spirit's ongoing and present work? How do we think about the doctrine of the Trinity and how it functions in the life of the believer? Right? All of these things are going to have to be brought to bear. When I first started thinking about spiritual formation, I ran into Willard and Foster and these folks, and I had a lot of questions. I loved it, but there were a lot of questions. And one of the questions I had worried for a bit that the discussion wasn't, I think at the time, this is way back when I was like early seminary, I worried it wasn't kind of biblical enough. And by that, I meant that it wasn't taking its directives from Scripture. The more I got into it, the more I began to realize, I don't think that's right, actually. I think, particularly with someone like Willard, he clearly is trying to do that. I think the bigger issue is that it was not theological. And even if you just think of like how many theologians are a part of that discussion, it's very few. It tends to be actually Bible scholars, psychologists, philosophers that have dominated the early phases of the spiritual formation discussion. And they've brought a lot of great things. It's been really helpful. But it has left it theologically underdetermined, and therefore there's a lot of slippage in various places where we need to kind of shore up an account that is distinctively Christian. And not only distinctively Christian in the broadest sense, but, for me, that means I want a distinctively evangelical account of these things, right? A Protestant view of salvation and the means of grace have to be up and running. We have to talk about what the church is and what the means of grace of the church are, and these various sorts of things. So we need a theological account. Again, this is one of the reasons my department talks in terms of a spiritual theology. We have to remember that it wasn't until probably the 19th century that theology and spirituality were divorced. Prior to that, the theologian's task was a distinctly spiritual task. And if you're a spiritual writer, you were doing theology. When these divorced, both of them died. This is why so many people, when they hear like we need to do more theology, maybe you just have this sense of like, oh, no, it just feels like death. And I've read those books too. That's not what I'm talking about. A theology that feels like death feels that way because it's been divorced from spirituality and it's been divorced from the presence of God. I'm interested in doing theology before the face of God. But likewise, when spirituality is divorced from theology, it dies and it ceases to be Christian. It becomes, again, pop psychological and sociological in a new age. It ceases to be about our formation and becomes about a kind of therapeutic ideal. What we need is a theological spiritual theology that helps us understand our calling in Christ and by the Spirit. But then secondly, and again, I'm going to follow Porter on this, we really need to kind of sit with our ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is our doctrine of the church. But here's something I want to say about this that I think is often missed. I meet a lot of folks who assume the church is important, who couldn't for the life of them tell me why. One of the downsides of the seeker-sensitive movement, that second wave that Wax narrates, is the seeker-sensitive movement secularized ecclesiology. And I don't think we've fully appreciated how devastating that has been. Most of my seminary students, when they first come to seminary, they assume the church is a secular entity. A sermon is just a talk. Worship is singing. The church is community. None of that is true. None of that is true. If that's true, all is lost. We are saved into a people as we are saved in Christ by His Spirit. We are adopted into Christ's family, into the family of our Heavenly Father, knowing Christ is our brother. And therefore, we are brother or sister with all the other believers we know, and therefore finding ourselves, and all the other believers we don't know as well, I should add, but then finding ourselves in a local community of faith where we belong to each other as brothers and sisters. We come together as a people to draw near corporately to the Lord, growing into Him who is our head, Paul says. I'm thinking here of Colossians 2:19. With a growth, we're growing with a growth that is from God. Right? So notice here that there's a communal growth, there's a communal spiritual formation, and the growth comes from God as we are united together. We are united in Christ. We have to begin to recognize not only a theological spiritual theology, but a theological ecclesiology, rather than reducing it down to its secular counterparts. Whatever else a sermon is, it isn't merely a talk. I was doing a series on preaching on my Substack. I'm going to continue that soon because, again, I think this is so often missed. A preacher isn't primarily a lecturer. Preaching and teaching are not the same thing. Part of what we're doing in preaching is we're calling people before their Lord, and we're shepherding people in the presence of God, before the face of God. When we sing, we are not merely, kind of generating passion or something like that. The whole church service is modeled after the Exodus. Right? We come through the water of our baptism as the sea. On the other side, we are praising the Lord in song, who delivered us from the land of slavery and death, and He's leading us to the promised land. Now we are in the wilderness of this present evil age, journeying to the mountain of the Lord to hear the word of the Lord declared as we eat spiritual food and drink spiritual drink, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. The church is not a secular entity. The problem has been we have had a kind of atheological view of spiritual formation, and we have had an atheological view of the church, and both have become secularized. Spiritual formation too often is just do disciplines, and it basically becomes Aristotelian and therefore self-help, rather than being governed by the Spirit. Now, I'm not suggesting someone like Willard's doing that. He's explicitly not doing that. But I do think people often read him that way. But then secondly, one of the reasons why spiritual formation hasn't infiltrated the church, I think, is because too often the church self-conceives as a secular entity. And so it uses secular metrics to judge its growth and to judge its value and its significance. And again, how many people show up has absolutely nothing to do with your faithfulness or blessing or something along those lines. There's a lot of naivete there. Jamin Goggin and I, my dear friend, have a whole podcast devoted to this question in many ways, the Way of the Lamb podcast, where we wrestle through the nature of the church and power, right? And so one of the problems is when the church became secularized, we began using not just worldly forms, although that's true, but demonic forms of power to further the gospel. That's just James 3:13 and following, if you're interested in that. But using worldly metrics is the same thing as using demonic metrics. The way of the cross leads us differently. And so as we consider kind of the nature of what is a church, what does it mean to proclaim the word? What does it mean to draw near together? What are the means of grace? How do we think about sacraments? We're not simply, having bread and juice or port if you're an Anglican, to kind of as like a visible kind of way to remember stuff. Like, we have to talk meaningfully about the Lord's presence. We have to talk about the means of grace, that God is doing something here. The church I grew up in, every time we did the Lord's Supper, which is very rare, all they ever said about it was, it's not meaningful. Well, whatever else it is, that seems to be the wrong approach. Because one day people are going to believe you. And they're going to one day wake up and they're going to go, wait, if that's not meaningful, is any of this meaningful? Well, why am I even here? And so we need to consider, right, what is the church biblically? What is the church theologically? What does it mean to be the people of God? How do we walk with this people in the wilderness of this present evil age as those delivered, transferred out of the age of death into the kingdom of his beloved Son, for life in his presence and life in the Spirit? And what's important about this, I think, is that if we have a real focus on ecclesiology, one of the things that we'll constantly be reminded about is that the church is formative precisely because it's not ultimately about your formation. It's about abandoning your life to God, something that Dallas Willard often tried to remind people, as he reminded me on occasion, and something that I've very much taken to heart from him. As an elder, I'm often reminded this. I'm an elder at my church. Again, I as I mentioned, I preach at least monthly. I think I preached 16 times last year, so it ended up being a little more than once a month. And what has become the kind of verse I go back to over and over and over again about being part of the church and as an elder being part of the church's leadership is that love does not demand its own way. And when I think about spiritual formation, in part, my formation is about me being able to say from my heart, I'm not going to demand my own way because I love this people. And we have to consider, is that true of us? That's easy to say. That hasn't been true of me in every season. That hasn't been true of me this year in every week. There's been times where I think I don't love these people. They're driving me nuts. But below that, there is a love. Beneath that frustration, there's a realization that I'm frustrated precisely because I love this people. And as I give myself to the life of the church, I'm constantly reminded that I'm not the answer to this. They don't need more of me. They need Jesus. We need each other to grow up into him who is our head. And so when we think about spiritual formation, we do have to attend to the fact that the conversation up until now has focused almost solely on individual spiritual formation. And then the shift has been made to generic community. Instead of that, I think we need to hold in both one hand, right? On one hand, we need to hold our individual formation. In the other hand, we need to hold ecclesial, churchly formation, and we need to feel the tensions between them. At the end of the day, it's not ultimately about you and your formation. That's not what spiritual formation is. It's about God, and it's about abandoning your life to God. And that means it's about partaking in this people. It means learning to love this people. It means being open to this people, to have a heart open to them. As Paul pleads the Corinthians, oh, Corinthians, our heart is open to you. Why isn't yours open to us? This is the plea of love. So as always with this podcast, my desire is not that you simply leave and think about these things, but ultimately that you draw near to your Lord. And so let me encourage you to draw near and ask the Lord the question, Lord, am I open to a people? Have I remained on the margins, uninterested in opening my heart to others? Have I made the church an institution that just kind of serves my formation and therefore is simply ultimately about me? Or have I really lost my life in order to find it in you and therefore in your body? Have I laid down my life and trusted that you are the one who picks it up? And you do so often in and through your people. Draw near to your Lord. Draw near to his people. And may the Lord encourage you this week and this day and this season to open your heart. I know for many of you, as for me, opening your heart to a people is hard precisely because we have before, and it has not turned out well. There's no easy or simple solution to that. But ultimately, the only path to healing is one through our pain. And so if you're not able to open to a people in this moment, open to the Lord and find at least a person. Seek the Lord and seek a path to walk with another before Jesus. Seeking him, trusting him, following him wherever he leads. May the Lord guide you. This has been Spiritual Formation, an invitation to drawing near. As always, your support is such an encouragement. Please subscribe and rate this podcast. And if this episode was helpful for you, subscribe to my newsletter at kylestrobel.substack.com.